The Arizona Territory holds secrets that civilized folks would never understand. When a woman runs from her past into the untamed wilderness, she discovers that some dangers are more tempting than terrifying. Sarah Mackenzie thought the worst thing that could happen was dying alone in a thunderstorm. She was wrong. The Apache warrior who found her shelter offered something far more dangerous than death, a passion that could destroy them both. In a land where white settlers and Apache warriors are sworn enemies, where one look across cultural lines can mean exile or execution, two souls are about to discover that the heart recognizes no boundaries. He warned her with words that still echo through the canyon winds. She should have listened, but when lightning splits the sky and two worlds collide in a remote mountain cabin, some forces prove stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than the laws of men. What happens when forbidden becomes irresistible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of Colonel James Morrison's cavalry saber striking his leather boot echoed through the pre-dawn darkness at Fort McDowell like a death knell. 3 days had passed since Sarah Mackenzie fled into the wilderness, and his rage had only intensified with each passing hour. Morrison stood on the wooden porch of his quarters, watching his men prepare for another day of pursuit. The silver saber at his side had been his grandfather's, carried through campaigns against the Seminoles in Florida and the Mexicans in Texas. It represented everything he believed about order, authority, and the natural hierarchy that placed men like him at the top of civilization's ladder. Sarah's rejection of his marriage proposal still burned in his chest like a brand. No woman had ever dared refuse him before, and certainly not some Eastern spinster whose family fortune had evaporated with her father's poor investments. She should have been grateful for his attention, honored by his offer to make her a respectable military wife. Instead, she had looked at him with those green eyes, full of disgust, and spoken words that still rang in his ears. "I would rather die alone in the desert than spend one day as your wife, Colonel Morris." The memory made his jaw clench as he watched Sergeant O'Malley approach with the morning report. O'Malley was a weathered Irish immigrant who had served under Morrison for 8 years, long enough to recognize the dangerous gleam in his commander's eyes. "Sir, the Apache scout found fresh sign about 15 miles northeast of here. Single horse, heading into the mountains." Morrison's hand tightened on his saber hilt. "How fresh?" "Maybe 6 hours old, sir. The woman's pushing hard, but her horse is wearing down. Martinez thinks we can catch her by midday if we leave within the hour." The Apache scout Martinez was a reservation Indian who had thrown in his lot with the cavalry after his own people cast him out for stealing horses. Morrison despised having to rely on an Apache for anything, but Martinez knew the territory better than any white man alive. "Prepare 20 men for immediate departure. Full field kit, 3 days' rations. And Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. When we find Miss Mackenzie, she's to be treated with the utmost courtesy. She's obviously suffering from female hysteria brought on by the stress of frontier life. Once we return her to proper supervision, I'm confident she'll recover her senses." O'Malley's weathered face remained carefully neutral. He had served long to recognize obsession disguised as duty, but questioning a superior officer's motives was a luxury sergeants couldn't afford. Within the hour, Morrison's column was riding northeast into country that grew more hostile with each mile. The Sonoran Desert gradually gave way to pine-covered mountains where Apache war parties could watch cavalry movements from hidden positions among the rocks. Morrison rode at the head of his men, his blue uniform immaculate despite the dust and heat. He had courted Sarah for 3 months with the methodical persistence he applied to military campaigns. Flowers delivered to her quarters, invitations to officers' dinners, carefully chaperoned walks around the fort's perimeter. She had accepted his attentions with polite reserve, never encouraging, but never quite refusing either. He interpreted her restraint as feminine modesty, appropriate behavior for a woman of breeding. The idea that she might genuinely find him repulsive never entered his considerations. Sarah represented everything Morrison believed he deserved. After 20 years of military service on the frontier, she was educated, refined, and came from the kind of Eastern family that commanded respect in civilized society. The fact that her family's money was gone mattered little. Morrison had accumulated enough wealth through careful investments and strategic seizures of Apache property to support a wife in proper style. His marriage proposal had been delivered with military precision in the parlor of the commanding officer's quarters, with proper witnesses present to ensure propriety. Sarah's violent rejection had caught him completely off guard. "You mistake duty for affection, Colonel Morrison," she had said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I cannot and will not marry a man who sees me as a prize to be claimed rather than a person to be cherished." The words had stung worse than Apache arrows. Morrison was accustomed to being respected, feared, and obeyed. Sarah's calm defiance challenged everything he understood about the proper relationship between men and women. Now, as his column climbed higher into Apache territory, Morrison told himself he was conducting a rescue mission. Sarah was obviously not thinking clearly. The frontier had broken stronger women than her, and he was merely fulfilling his duty as a gentleman and an officer to protect her from her own poor judgment. But underneath his rationalized sense of duty burned something darker and more possessive. Sarah Mackenzie would be his wife, whether she understood that destiny or not. Some women simply needed firm masculine guidance to recognize their proper place in the world. The mountains ahead held many dangers, but Morrison feared none of them. He had fought Apaches for 8 years and survived encounters that killed better men. One confused woman, no matter how stubborn, would not escape the reach of his authority. His saber bounced against his leg with each stride of his horse, a familiar weight that reminded him of all the obstacles he had overcome through determination and superior firepower. Sarah Mackenzie would learn, as his enemies always learned, that Colonel James Morrison was not a man to be denied. The eagle feathers in Nalnish's war bonnet caught the morning light as he studied the white woman from his concealed position among the rocks. Each feather had been earned through acts of courage that proved his worthiness to lead Apache warriors into battle against their enemies. The bonnet itself had belonged to his grandfather, a war chief who had fought Mexican soldiers before the Americans came with their blue uniforms and broken promises. Sarah's chestnut mare picked its way carefully along the narrow trail, unaware that 5 Apache warriors watched every step from positions that offered perfect fields of fire. The woman rode with the exhausted determination of someone who had pushed beyond the limits of endurance, but her posture still carried traces of Eastern refinement that marked her as different from the rough frontier women who usually ventured into Apache territory. Nalnish raised his hand in a subtle signal, and his warriors emerged from concealment with the fluid grace of shadows taking physical form. They moved to surround the white woman's horse in a matter of heartbeats, cutting off every avenue of escape with the practiced efficiency of men who had perfected this maneuver through countless raids and ambushes. The woman's reaction surprised him. Instead of screaming or fainting as most white women did when confronted by Apache warriors, she simply sat straighter in her saddle and met his gaze with eyes the color of high mountain forests. There was fear there, certainly, but also a kind of resigned courage that spoke of someone who had already accepted the possibility of death. When their eyes met, something passed between them that Nalnish had never experienced in 32 years of life. It felt like recognition, as if his soul had been waiting his entire existence for this exact moment to encounter this particular woman. The sensation was so powerful it nearly made him step backward, and he saw in her widening eyes that she felt it too. "Shia," whispered Goyakla, the youngest of his warriors. "She looks at you, like she knows you." "Quiet," Nalnish replied, in Apache, never taking his eyes from the woman's face. "Let me think." The practical part of his mind catalogued tactical details with automatic precision. She rode alone, which meant no immediate military support. Her horse showed signs of hard travel, but was well-bred stock, worth taking even if they killed the rider. Her clothing was expensive, but travel-worn, suggesting someone fleeing rather than exploring. But another part of his mind, a part that had nothing to do with warfare or survival, was studying the curve of her cheek and the way sunlight caught in her dark hair. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with Apache's standards of attractiveness, yet something about her stirred responses in him that were deeply familiar. "We should kill her and take the horse," said Chato, the most practical of his warriors. "White women bring soldier nothing but trouble." "This one is different," Nalnish said, still studying Sarah's face. "Different how?" demanded Doyakla. "She is still white, still our enemy." Nalnish couldn't explain what he meant, partly because he didn't fully understand it himself. Apache culture had clear rules about dealing with white captives, especially women. They could be killed immediately, taken as slaves, or occasionally adopted into the tribe after proving their worth through suffering and submission. But looking at this woman, none of those options felt right. She didn't have the soft weakness most white women he had encountered. Something in her bearing suggested she understood hardship, that life had already taught her lessons about survival that most of her people never learned. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Nalnish glanced at the approaching storm clouds. The weather would provide cover for whatever decision he made, but it also meant finding shelter soon or watching their captive die of exposure. Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the obvious danger of her situation. "I'm not carrying any weapons. My horse is tired, and I have very little food. If you're going to kill me, please do it quickly." Her words were directed at Nalnish, as if she had correctly identified him as the leader, despite having no apparent knowledge of Apache military structure. More surprising was the complete absence of pleading or attempts at bargaining. She simply stated facts and accepted whatever fate awaited her. "You speak as if you expect to die," Nalnish said in English, surprising his warriors who had rarely heard him use the white man's language. "I've been expecting to die for 3 days," Sarah replied. "If Apache warriors don't kill me, the storm will. If the storm doesn't kill me, the men pursuing me will. At this point, I'm more concerned with dying with dignity than avoiding death entirely." The honesty in her voice struck him like a physical blow. This was not the attitude of someone who believed her white skin would protect her or who expected Apache warriors to show mercy based on her gender. She had looked death in the face and made her peace with it. "What men pursue you?" Nalnish asked. "Cavalry, led by a colonel who believes I belong to him." The simple statement contained layers of information that Nalnish's experienced mind immediately interpreted. She was fleeing forced marriage, probably to a military officer who had mistaken authority for affection. The scenario was common enough on the frontier, where white women had few rights and fewer choices. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first heavy raindrops began falling with the promise of a serious storm to follow. The sacred medicine bundle at Nalnish's waist seemed to grow heavier as he stared at the white woman, feeling forces within himself that threatened everything he understood about duty, loyalty, and survival. The bundle contained items passed down from his grandfather's grandfather, sacred stones from the 4 directions, herbs blessed by medicine men, and small bones from animals that had given their lives to sustain Apache people through generations of struggle. His grandmother had sewn the leather pouch with her own hands, decorating it with beadwork that told the story of his family's connection to the mountain spirits. She had pressed it into his hands on the day he became a war leader, whispering prayers in the old language and warning him that a warrior's greatest battles were often fought within his own heart. Now, facing this white woman whose green eyes seemed to see straight through to his soul, Nalnish understood what his grandmother had meant. "I can't control myself around you," he said in English, the words emerging from some deep place he hadn't known existed. The admission surprised him as much as it did his warriors, who exchanged glances that spoke of concern for their leader's judgment. Sarah's horse shifted nervously beneath her as rain began falling harder, but she never broke eye contact with Nalnish. Something in his voice, some raw honesty that transcended the language barrier between their worlds, told her that whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died. "Then perhaps you should stay away from me," she replied quietly. The response drew unexpected laughter from Nalnish. a sound that seemed to surprise even him. In this storm, in this country, there is nowhere to stay away. We find shelter together, or we die apart. Chateau stepped forward, his weather-darkened face grim with disapproval. Chie, this is madness. She is white. Her people have killed our children, stolen our land, broken every promise they ever made. You would risk our lives for a woman whose skin marks her as our enemy. Look at her eyes, Nalnish commanded. Tell me what you see. Chateau studied Sarah's face with the careful attention of a warrior who had learned to read enemies and allies with equal precision. What he saw there made him pause. These were not the eyes of someone who had lived a soft life behind fort walls, protected by soldiers and sustained by supplies stolen from Apache people. I see someone who has known loss, Chateau admitted, reluctantly. And hunger, added Goyakla. And betrayal, finished Nalnish. She runs from her own people, just as we have been forced to run. Her enemies wear the same blue coats as ours. Thunder crashed overhead with the sound of mountains splitting apart, and lightning illuminated the storm clouds that promised to unleash the desert's fury upon anyone caught in the open. The rain was falling steadily now, turning the dusty trail into treacherous mud. Sarah pulled her woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders, but the fabric was already soaked through. Her mare stood with head lowered against the wind, flanks trembling with exhaustion and cold. We need shelter, Nalnish said to his warriors in Apache. The old cabin in Red Rock Canyon. It will hold all of us. You mean to take her with us? Chateau demanded. I mean to keep us all alive through this storm. What happens after that? Nalnish touched his medicine bundle, feeling the weight of ancestral wisdom pressing against his ribs. What happens after that will be decided by powers greater than any of us. He turned back to Sarah, switching to English with the fluid ease that still surprised his men. Few of them knew he had spent 3 years at the mission school before fleeing back to his people, or that he understood the white man's language better than most whites understood. Apache. Can you ride through this storm? Sarah glanced at her trembling horse, then at the lightning that split the sky with increasing frequency. Not much choice, is there? There is always choice. Death is also choice. The matter-of-fact way he stated this truth struck Sarah as fundamentally different from the way white men talked about death. Morrison and his kind spoke of death as something that happened to other people, something to be avoided through superior firepower and tactical advantage. This Apache warrior spoke of death as a familiar neighbor, neither friend nor enemy, but simply another fact of existence. Then I choose to ride, she said. Nalnish nodded and spoke rapidly to his warriors in Apache. Whatever he said caused immediate movement as they prepared to depart, but Sarah noticed that 2 of them looked deeply unhappy with their leader's decision. They don't approve of your choice, she observed. They are not required to approve, only to follow. And if your choice gets them killed? Nalnish looked at her with something that might have been respect. Then I will die beside them, and my spirit will answer to theirs in the place where all warriors go. He mounted his paint stallion with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, then extended his hand toward Sarah. Stay close. This country kills those who wander from the path. As their hands touched briefly, Sarah felt the same jolt of recognition that had struck her when their eyes first met. Whatever force had brought them together in this desolate place was stronger than tribal loyalties, cultural barriers, or the approaching storm that threatened to wash away everything in its path. The wooden cross hanging from Sarah's neck felt heavier with each mile they climbed into the mountain. Her mother had pressed it into her hands on her deathbed, whispering prayers about salvation and the importance of maintaining Christian virtue in a godless world. The cross was carved from Boston oak, blessed by a minister who had never seen country like this, never imagined that faith might be tested by forces that had nothing to do with Sunday sermons and church socials. Now riding behind Apache warriors through a landscape that seemed designed to humble human pretensions, Sarah found herself questioning everything her Christian upbringing had taught her about good and evil, civilization and savagery, the proper order of God's creation. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and oak that provided minimal shelter from the driving rain. Lighting illuminated the surrounding peaks with stark clarity, revealing a wilderness so vast and unforgiving that it made human concerns seem trivial by comparison. Nalnish rode ahead of her, moving with an easy confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity with this country. His paint stallion picked its way around loose rocks and washed out sections of trail without any apparent guidance from its rider, as if horse and man shared some understanding that transcended normal communication. Behind them, the other Apache warriors maintained positions that provided security while allowing rapid movement. Sarah recognized the tactical formation, even though she had no military training. These men moved through hostile territory with the practiced efficiency of those who knew that survival depended on constant vigilance. The storm intensified as they climbed higher, transforming from steady rain into a deluge that reduced visibility to mere yards. Thunder echoed off canyon walls with a sound like artillery, and the wind carried the scent of lightning-struck pine and wet stone. Sarah's mare stumbled on a slick rock, nearly unseating her rider before regaining its footing. The near fall sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah's already exhausted system, reminding her how easily death could claim the unwary in this unforgiving country. "Not much farther," Nalnish called back to her, his voice barely audible above the storm. True to his word, the trail began descending into a narrow canyon where red sandstone walls provided some protection from the wind. Ancient petroglyphs marked the stone faces, weathered but still visible symbols left by people who had sheltered in this place long before either Apache or white settlers arrived. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the canyon wall, so perfectly integrated into the landscape that Sarah almost missed it entirely. Built from local stone and timber, it seemed to grow from the rock face itself rather than being imposed upon it. "My father built this place," Nalnish said as they approached. "He said a man needed somewhere to think away from the noise of other people." The structure was larger than Sarah had expected, with a covered porch that provided shelter for the horses and a chimney that promised warmth against the mountain cold. Whoever had designed it understood both Apache building techniques and the practical requirements of surviving in harsh country. Nalnish dismounted and moved to help Sarah from her horse, with a courtesy that seemed natural rather than calculated. When his hands touched her waist to steady her descent, she felt that same electric connection that had struck her during their first encounter. "Thank you," she said, surprised by how breathless the simple contact had left her. Their eyes met and held for a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it actually lasted. In the depths of his dark gaze, Sarah saw something that made her cross feel like a barrier rather than a comfort. The moment was broken by Chato's practical voice as he led the horses toward the covered area. "The storm will last through the night, maybe longer." Inside, the cabin revealed careful construction and thoughtful design. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a chimney that drew proper, despite the wind outside. Sleeping areas were separated by hanging blankets that provided privacy while maintaining the open feel of the main room. Most surprising were the books. A small shelf near the fireplace held volumes that spoke of someone's hunger for learning beyond what Apache oral tradition provided. Sarah recognized some titles: Shakespeare, the Bible, a medical text, and others in languages she couldn't identify. "Your father was educated," she observed. "He believed knowledge was like water. It doesn't matter where it comes from if you're dying of thirst." Nalnish moved to build a fire with the efficient motions of long practice. Soon flames were crackling against dry wood, filling the cabin with welcome warmth and light that pushed back the storm's darkness. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the strong line of his jaw and the careful way he arranged kindling to ensure the fire would burn steadily through the night. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength, qualities she had rarely encountered in the men of her own culture. When he caught her watching him, she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we decide what comes next." But Sarah knew that rest would be impossible with him so close, with the storm raging outside and the growing awareness that this night would change everything between them. Sarah's leather-bound journal felt damp against her fingers as she pulled it from her saddlebags, careful to keep the precious book away from the fire's sparks. She had maintained this record of her thoughts and experiences since leaving Boston, filling its pages with observations about frontier life that had shocked and educated her in equal measure. Tonight, surrounded by Apache warriors in a hidden mountain cabin, she found herself writing words that would have scandalized the proper Boston ladies who had raised her to believe that civilization ended at the Mississippi River. The other warriors had settled into sleep with the practiced ease of men, accustomed to taking rest whenever opportunity allowed. They had accepted Nalnish's decision to shelter the white woman without further argument, but Sarah could feel their watchful awareness even in apparent slumber. Only Nalnish remained awake, tending the fire with methodical attention, while rain drummed against the cabin's roof with increasing intensity. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and Sarah realized they might be trapped together for days rather than hours. "You write in the white man's marks," Nalnish observed, his voice quiet enough not to disturb his sleeping warriors. "You recognize writing. I spent 3 years at the mission school near Tucson. The black robes believed they could make me into a white man if they taught me enough white man's knowledge." Sarah looked up from her journal, studying his face in the firelight. "What made you leave?" "I learned to read their holy book. It spoke much of love and forgiveness, but the men who taught it showed little of either to Apache children who missed their families." The simple statement contained depths of pain that Sarah recognized from her own experiences with religious institutions. Her father's minister had preached charity while foreclosing on widows' homes. The church ladies who raised her after her mother's death had spoken of Christian love while gossiping viciously about anyone who failed to meet their rigid standards. "The mission teachers told us that Apache ways were evil," Nalnish continued, "that our ceremonies were devil worship, our traditions were primitive superstition. They said we had to choose between being Apache and being saved. What did you choose?" "I chose to save myself from them." Sarah found herself writing these words in her journal, capturing not just the conversation, but the way firelight played across Nalnish's features as he spoke, the careful way he selected English words to express concepts that probably had no direct translation from Apache. "Why do you write about this?" he asked, nodding toward her journal. "Because someday people will want to know what really happened out here. Not the stories they tell in newspapers back east, but what it was actually like for people caught between two worlds." "And what will you tell them about tonight?" Sarah's pen hesitated above the page. How could she explain the strange sense of recognition she felt when looking at this man? How could she describe the way her heart raced when he spoke her name, or the growing certainty that meeting him had changed something fundamental about her understanding of herself? "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I'm still trying to understand it myself." Nalnish rose from his position by the fire and moved to the small shelf of books. He selected a worn volume and returned to sit across from Sarah, but closer now, close enough that she could smell the scent of sage and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "My father read to me from this when I was young," he said, showing her a collection of Shakespeare's plays. "Before I understood that white men considered us too primitive for such learning." Sarah examined the book, noting the careful way pages had been mended and the marginalia written in 2 different hands. "Your father made notes, and I added my own. Shakespeare wrote about people caught between worlds, people who loved across boundaries that society said could not be crossed." The observation struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had read these same plays in her comfortable Boston parlor, but always as entertainment, never as instruction about the complexities of forbidden attraction. "Romeo and Juliet," she said softly, "among others, but also Othello, Antony and Cleopatra, stories where love becomes a battlefield and passion destroys as often as it saves." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between them like another presence in the cabin. Outside, lightning continued to illuminate the canyon walls and thunder rolled across the mountain peaks with the sound of gods at war. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. "Because tomorrow you will have to choose. When this storm ends, you can ride back toward the settlements and the life your people expect you to live. Or you can discover what it means to live without the boundaries that have shaped everything you thought you knew about yourself." Sarah's journal lay open on her lap, blank pages waiting for words that might determine the course of her entire future. The silver bracelet on Nalnish's wrist caught the firelight as he reached for another piece of wood, and Sarah noticed how his fingers automatically turned the metal band whenever he seemed lost in difficult memories. The bracelet was clearly Apache work, delicate silver wire twisted into patterns that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship and deep cultural meaning. "That belonged to someone important," Sarah observed, closing her journal and setting it aside. Nalnish paused in his fire tending, looking down at the bracelet as if seeing it for the first time. "My mother. She made it during the winter before the soldiers came to our village." Something in his voice warned Sarah that she was approaching painful territory, but her growing understanding of this man made her want to know everything about the experiences that had shaped him. "Will you tell me what happened?" For a long moment, Nalnish stared into the flames without speaking. The sleeping warriors around them breathed with the steady rhythm of men who had learned to rest deeply whenever safety allowed, but Sarah sensed that peaceful sleep was a luxury their leader rarely enjoyed. "I was 17, he said finally. "Old enough to fight, but my mother insisted I stay with the women and children when the warriors rode out to raid a supply train. She said the spirits had warned her that blood would flow like water that day." He turned the bracelet again, a gesture so automatic Sarah suspected he was unaware of it. The warriors were gone 3 days. On the third morning, cavalry came to our camp. They said they were looking for stolen horses, but their eyes counted our people like a man counts his money. Sarah had heard stories about cavalry raids from the military wives at Fort McDowell, but those accounts always portrayed Apache camps as dangerous strongholds that threatened innocent settlers. Hearing the same events described from the other perspective sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The officer in charge was a young lieutenant who wore his authority like a new coat, stiff and uncomfortable. He demanded to know where our warriors had gone, and when the elders refused to answer, he ordered his men to search the camp. Nalnish's hand moved to the bracelet again, and Sarah noticed that his other hand had unconsciously clenched into a fist. They found cavalry equipment in one of the lodges, saddles, bridles, things our warriors had taken in raids. The lieutenant declared that this was proof we were hostiles harboring stolen government property. "What did your mother do?" She stood between the soldiers and the lodge where the children were hiding. She was wearing this bracelet and a dress she had decorated with beadwork that told the story of our family's history. She looked like an Apache woman should look, proud and unafraid. The fire crackled and hissed as rain found its way down the chimney, sending small puffs of steam into the warm air. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain peaks with undiminished fury. The lieutenant ordered her to move aside so his men could search for weapons. When she refused, he struck her with the back of his hand hard enough to draw blood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had witnessed enough of military arrogance to know that soldiers often viewed Apache women as obstacles to be removed, rather than human beings deserving of basic respect. I tried to go to her, but she caught my eye and shook her head just slightly. She knew that if I fought the soldiers, they would have excuse to kill everyone in the camp. So you watched. I watched my mother die for the crime of protecting Apache children from white soldiers. I watched them burn our camp and drive off our horses. I watched them ride away laughing about how easy it had been to solve their Indian problem. Nalnish was no longer looking at the fire. His eyes had found Sarah's face, and in their depths she saw pain that went deeper than personal loss. After they left, I cut this bracelet from my mother's wrist and swore by her spirit that no white person would ever again have power over Apache lives while I drew breath. The weight of that oath hung between them like a physical presence. Sarah understood that by sharing this story, Nalish was revealing not just personal tragedy, but the fundamental reason why love between them seemed impossible. "And yet you saved me," she said quietly. "Yes. Why?" Nalish reached across the space between them and touched her hand with fingers that trembled slightly despite his warrior's training. "Because when I look at you, I don't see the people who killed my mother. I see someone who has also lost everything to the cruelty of others." The simple touch sent electricity through Sarah's entire body, but it was the vulnerability in his voice that truly undid her. Here was a man who had every reason to hate her simply for the color of her skin, yet something in her drew him beyond the boundaries of reasonable caution. "Nalish, say my name again." Nalish, this time when he touched her, it was to trace the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled the hidden daguerreotype from its secret pocket sewn into her traveling dress. The photograph was wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, but even so, the edges had begun to yellow with age and handling. She had carried this image for 3 years without showing it to another soul, uncertain of what questions it might raise about her own identity. The fire provided enough light to see the carefully posed figures captured by the photographer's art 15 years earlier. A stern-faced missionary stood beside a young Apache woman who wore the forced smile of someone unaccustomed to white man's customs. But it was the child in the woman's arms that made Sarah's breath catch every time she looked at this photograph. "My grandmother," she said quietly, offering the daguerreotype to Nalish. "Though I didn't know she was Apache until after she died." Nalish took the photograph with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects, studying the faces with the intense attention of someone reading a story written in features and expressions. "Your family told you she was Mexican," he said. "It wasn't a question. How did you know?" "It was common then. Apache children taken by missionaries, raised to forget their people, married to white men who never knew their wives' true heritage. The church thought they were saving souls. The women lost their names, their language, their connection to everything that made them who they were." Sarah watched his face as he examined the photograph, noting how his expression shifted from curiosity to recognition to something deeper and more complex. "She has the cheekbones of the mountain people," he said finally, "and the way she holds her shoulders, even in white woman's clothing. She remembers being Apache even if she cannot speak of it. I found this after she died, hidden in a Bible with papers that told the real story. She was taken during a cavalry raid when she was 8 years old. The missionaries gave her a Christian name and taught her that her people were savages who would burn in hell." Nalish handed the photograph back to Sarah, but not before she caught the flash of anger that crossed his features. She was beginning to recognize that expression, the carefully controlled fury that Apache men learned to hide when confronted with the systematic destruction of their culture. What was her Apache name? "The papers called her Bright Water Woman, but I never heard anyone use that name while she was alive." Bright Water Woman. Nalish spoke the name with a reverence that made it sound like a prayer. She was born to the Chiricahua band. Her family was known for their skill with plants and healing. Sarah's heart began racing. "You knew her people." "My grandmother told stories about a medicine woman named Bright Water Woman, who disappeared during the raids of 1855. She was said to have the gift of seeing the future in water reflections." The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. All her life she had felt disconnected from the Boston society that claimed her, sensing that some essential part of her identity remained hidden even from herself. Now, sitting in an Apache cabin with rain drumming overhead, she was discovering roots that explained everything about her restless spirit and her strange sense of recognition when she looked at this untamed country. "That would make you," Nalish began, then stopped as the implications became clear. "Apache by blood, even if not by culture," Sarah finished. "A quarter Apache, raised to believe that my grandmother's people were less than human. The irony was bitter enough to taste. She had been taught to fear Apache warriors as savage killers, never knowing that Apache blood flowed in her own veins. The Christian ladies who raised her would have been horrified to discover they had been sheltering the granddaughter of a heathen squaw. "Does this change how you see me?" she asked. Malnish was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he processed this new information. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone choosing his words with extraordinary care. "It explains why your spirit recognized this place, why you didn't break when you should have broken, why looking at you feels like coming home to something I never knew I had lost." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "But it also makes this more dangerous for both of us." "How?" "Because now you are not just a white woman I have saved from a storm. You are Apache blood returning to Apache land, and my people will see that as either a sign from the spirits or a curse that will destroy us all." Sarah stared down at their joined hands, his darker skin against her lighter complexion telling the visual story of everything that divided and connected them. "Which do you think it is?" "I think," Malnish said quietly, "that some forces are stronger than the boundaries men create to separate themselves from what they fear to desire." The traditional Apache courtship necklace lay between them on the rough wooden floor, its intricate beadwork catching the firelight like captured stars. Malnish had pulled it from his saddlebags with hands that shook slightly, as if the weight of what he was offering had physical substance beyond the turquoise and silver beads woven into ancient patterns. "My grandmother made this for the woman I would choose," he said quietly, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "She worked on it for 3 winters, adding prayers to every bead, every knot of sinew that holds it together." Sarah stared at the necklace, understanding instinctively that this was no casual gift. The beadwork told a story in colors and patterns that spoke of generations of Apache women who had worn similar ornaments to mark their passage from maidenhood to wifehood. "Malnish, I can't. We both know this is impossible. Nothing is impossible until we choose to make it so." The sleeping warriors around them stirred restlessly, and Sarah wondered if they sensed the tension crackling between their leader and the white woman he had brought into their sanctuary. Chato's eyes opened briefly, assessed the situation with a warrior's instinct for danger, then closed again with the resigned expression of someone who recognized that some battles could not be won through force. "If I wear this, what does it mean to your people?" "It means you belong to me, and I belong to you, regardless of what the world thinks about the color of our skin." Sarah reached out to touch one of the turquoise beads, feeling the smooth stone that had been shaped by hands that understood the sacred significance of every element. The necklace was beautiful beyond anything she had ever seen, but its beauty carried obligations that terrified her. "And if we're caught, if the cavalry finds us, or if your own people decide I'm a threat, then we face whatever comes together." The simple statement contained depths of commitment that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. She had spent her entire life in a world where men made promises easily and broke them just as casually. Morrison had promised to cherish and protect her, but his idea of protection involved ownership and control. Malnish was offering something entirely different, not protection from the world's dangers, but partnership in facing them. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain peaks, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the whispered breathing of sleeping warriors. Sarah felt as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything about her life forever. "Show me how to put it on," she said quietly. Malnish lifted the necklace with infinite care, his fingers sure despite the tremor she could see in his hands. As he moved behind her to fasten the leather ties at the back of her neck, Sarah felt his breath against her skin and had to close her eyes against the intensity of sensation. When the necklace settled against her throat, it felt warm, as if the beads had absorbed heat from the hands that made them. The weight was substantial, but not uncomfortable, and Sarah found herself touching the central pendant, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a mountain. "It suits you," Malnish said, moving back to face her. "My grandmother always said it would know its proper owner." And what do you think she would say about me wearing it? I think she would say that the spirits work in ways that confuse the living but make perfect sense to those who have crossed over to the other side. Sarah looked down at the necklace, seeing how the blue and silver beads complemented her skin tone in ways that seemed natural rather than artificial. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt as if she were wearing something that expressed her true self rather than the expectations of others. Now, Nish, yes? When I was a child, I used to dream about a man with dark eyes who would find me in a place where water sang and mountains touched the sky. I never understood what those dreams meant. And now, instead of answering with words, Sarah moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. When she raised her face to his, she could see her own reflection in his pupils, and for the first time in her life, she liked what she saw there. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered without words. But when she didn't pull away, when her hand moved to rest against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating like a war drum, the kiss deepened into something that burned away every barrier between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Sarah could see in Nalish's eyes the same mixture of desire and amazement that she felt coursing through her own veins. "Now there's no going back," he whispered against her forehead. "I don't want to go back," she replied, meaning every word. Colonel Morrison's military field glasses felt cold and heavy in his hands as he studied the rocky terrain ahead, their brass fittings dulled by 3 days of hard riding through increasingly hostile country. The powerful lenses brought distant objects into sharp focus, but they also represented everything he believed about the superiority of military technology over primitive Apache tactics. Through the glasses he could see smoke rising from a hidden canyon about 2 miles northeast of their current position. It was thin, carefully controlled smoke that spoke of someone who understood the importance of concealing their location from unfriendly eyes. "Thines," he called to the Apache scout who rode slightly ahead of the main column. "What do you make of that smoke?" The reservation Apache studied the distant mountains with eyes that had been trained from childhood to read the subtle signs that white men missed entirely. Martinez had learned to balance survival against loyalty, serving the cavalry that fed his family while carefully avoiding information that might get his own people killed. "Could be many things, Colonel. Shepherds, prospectors, maybe just travelers waiting out the storm." Morrison lowered his field glasses and fixed Martinez with the cold stare that had intimidated subordinates for 20 years. "Or it could be Apache warriors with my runaway bride." "Could be," Martinez agreed carefully. He had seen enough of Morrison's obsession with the Mackenzie woman to know that contradicting the colonel's assumptions was dangerous to his own health. The cavalry column had been riding hard for 2 days, following a trail that grew more difficult to read with each mile of rocky ground and storm-washed terrain. Morrison's determination to recover Sarah had become something approaching madness, driving his men beyond the limits of normal endurance. Sergeant O'Malley rode up from his position with the rear guard, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that experienced soldiers learn to deliver without emotion. "Colonel, we're down to half rations and the horses are starting to break down. Maybe we should consider turning back to the fort and organizing a proper expedition." Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his saber hilt, a gesture that made every man in the column tense with anticipation of violent orders. They had all seen what happened to subordinates who questioned the colonel's judgment when his blood was up. "Sergeant, are you suggesting that we abandon a white woman to Apache savages because your men are too soft to complete their mission?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that dead soldiers can't rescue anybody." The blunt honesty in O'Malley's voice surprised Morris. The Irish sergeant had served under him for 8 years without ever directly challenging an order, but the strain of this pursuit was testing loyalties that had seemed unbreakable. "Miss Mackenzie is somewhere in those mountains, probably being subjected to unspeakable horrors by the same animals who have been raiding our supply lines for months. Every minute we delay increases the likelihood that we'll find her dead body instead of bringing her home alive." Morrison raised his field glasses again, scanning the canyon where smoke continued to rise in thin, disciplined streams. In his mind, he could see Sarah tied up in some filthy Apache wickiup, suffering degradations that no civilized woman should endure. The image fed his rage and justified whatever measures might be necessary to retrieve her. Apache warriors understood only force, and Morrison was prepared to deliver force in quantities that would teach them to respect white authority. Martinez, how many warriors could that smoke represent? The scout studied the distant mountains again, calculating not just tactical realities, but the political consequences of whatever answer he gave. Too high a number might make Morrison reconsider the attack. Too low might get them all killed. Hard to say, Colonel. Could be a small hunting party, maybe 5 or 6 warriors. Could be more. And how well do you know that country? Well enough. There are old trails through those canyons, places where a man could hide or make a stand if he knew the ground. Morrison nodded with satisfaction. Military success required superior intelligence and overwhelming force applied at the decisive moment. His field glasses had given him the intelligence. His 20 seasoned cavalrymen would provide the force. We'll approach from the south, using that ridgeline for concealment. When we're in position, we'll hit them fast and hard before they know we're there. O'Malley exchanged glances with Martinez, recognizing the signs of a commanding officer whose judgment had been clouded by personal obsession. They had both seen enough Indian fighting to know that Apache warriors were never as helpless as white officers assumed them to be. Colonel, O'Malley said carefully, maybe we should send Martinez ahead to scout the situation before we commit the whole column. Negative. We go in together, or not at all. I won't risk having Miss Mackenzie move to another location while we waste time gathering intelligence. Through his field glasses, Morrison studied the canyon approaches one more time, already planning the attack that would restore his authority and recover the woman who had dared to reject his protection. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that settled everything between him and the Apache warriors who had stolen his property. Sarah's mother's gold wedding ring caught the morning light as she turned it nervously around her finger, a habit she had developed during the long nights when sleep refused to come. The ring represented everything her mother had believed about marriage, duty, sacrifice, and the acceptance of whatever fate men decided was appropriate for women. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline dawn that revealed the true majesty of the canyon where they had sheltered. Red sandstone walls rose toward a sky so blue it seemed artificial, and the air carried the clean scent of rain-washed sage and pine. Nalnish stood at the canyon's edge, studying the valley below with the focused attention of a man who understood that survival depended on constant vigilance. His warriors had awakened before dawn and taken positions that provided both security and advance warning of approaching danger. "They're coming," he said without turning around. "Maybe 20 men, moving up the south trail." Sarah felt her stomach clench with the familiar mixture of fear and guilt that had haunted her since fleeing Fort McDowell. She had known that Morrison would follow, but seeing the reality of military pursuit made her question every decision that had brought her to this moment. "I should go to them," she said quietly. "This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I chose to help you. But your people, my people, have been fighting cavalry for 30 years. We know how to make soldiers regret their decisions." Sarah looked down at her mother's ring, remembering the stories she had heard about her parents' courtship and marriage. Her father had been a proper Boston gentleman who courted her mother with flowers and poetry, who spoke of protecting her from the harsh realities of an uncivilized world. But protection, Sarah had learned, could become another form of prison when it was used to justify control over every aspect of a woman's life. Her mother had worn this ring for 23 years, and Sarah had never once seen genuine happiness in her eyes. "Nalnish, what happens if we survive this? Where do we go? How do we live?" He turned from his watch position to face her, and Sarah could see in his expression the same questions that kept her awake at night. Love might conquer many obstacles, but it couldn't erase the fundamental realities of a world that refused to accept relationships that crossed racial boundaries. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know what happens if we don't try. You go back to a life that was killing your spirit piece by piece, and I go back to being a man who let fear choose his future for him." The honesty in his voice made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. She had spent her entire life around men who claimed to have all the answers, who spoke with absolute certainty about topics they understood only superficially. Nalnish's willingness to admit uncertainty felt like a gift. "My mother wore this ring until the day she died," Sarah said, showing him the simple gold band. "She told me it represented the sacred bond between husband and wife, the promise to love and honor regardless of circumstances. And what do you think it represents?" Sarah considered the question while studying the ring that had seemed so significant during her privileged Boston childhood. Now, in the harsh light of desert morning, with cavalry approaching and her future hanging in the balance, it looked like what it actually was, a circle of metal that meant only what the people wearing it chose to make it mean. "I think it represents my mother's choice to accept limitations instead of fighting for something better." She slipped the ring from her finger and held it out toward Nalnish. "I don't want to make the same choice." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you're willing to find out what's possible when two people refuse to let the world's expectations define their future." Before Nalnish could respond, Chato appeared at the canyon rim, moving with the urgent efficiency that signaled immediate danger. "Shea, they're closer than we thought. The colonel pushes his men hard, and they'll be in rifle range within the hour." Nalnish looked from Sarah to his warrior, then back to the ring she still held between them. The weight of leadership pressed down on him like a physical burden, but Sarah could see the moment when personal desire overcame tactical caution. "Then we make our stand here," he said, taking the ring and slipping it into the medicine bundle at his waist. "Whatever comes, we face it as one people." Sarah felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that had been missing from every major decision she had made in her 29 years of life. For the first time, she was choosing her own fate, instead of accepting whatever others decided was appropriate for her. The blood-stained cavalry dispatch clutched in Martinez's trembling hand contained news that changed everything about the territorial conflict raging across Arizona. The Apache scout had intercepted the message during a pre-dawn reconnaissance, and now he stood before Colonel Morrison with information that made their pursuit of Sarah Mackenzie seem insignificant by comparison. "Colonel, you need to see this," Martinez said, offering the crumpled paper with obvious reluctance. Morrison snatched the dispatch and read quickly, his face growing pale as he absorbed the implications of what he was seeing. The message was from General Crook's headquarters in Tucson, reporting that Geronimo had broken from the reservation with over 100 warriors and was moving north toward the very mountains where they now pursued a runaway woman. "When was this sent?" Morrison demanded. 3 days ago. The courier was delayed. Morrison didn't need to ask what kind of delay had prevented military communications from reaching their destination. Apache war parties had been systematically disrupting cavalry operations for weeks, striking supply lines and communication routes with the tactical precision that made them such dangerous opponents. "Geronimo," Morrison whispered, the name carrying weight that every man in the column immediately understood. The legendary Apache leader represented everything that white settlers feared most about the hostile tribes that refused to accept reservation life. Unlike younger war chiefs who fought with passion but little strategic thinking, Geronimo combined traditional Apache warfare with a sophisticated understanding of military tactics, learned through decades of conflict with both Mexican and American forces. "Sir," Sergeant O'Malley said carefully, "if Geronimo's in these mountains with 100 warriors, maybe we should reconsider our mission priorities." Morrison looked up from the dispatch, his eyes showing the dangerous glitter that his men had learned to fear. The news about Geronimo should have been enough to make any rational officer withdraw to safer ground, but Sarah Mackenzie's rejection had pushed Morrison beyond the boundaries of military logic. "Sergeant, are you suggesting that we abandon an American citizen to Apache savages because you're afraid of a broken-down old Indian?" "I'm suggesting that 20 cavalrymen against 100 Apache warriors isn't tactics, it's suicide." The blunt assessment hung in the morning air like a challenge to Morrison's authority. O'Malley had served long enough to recognize the difference between reasonable risk and pointless sacrifice, but his colonel seemed incapable of making that distinction. "Miss Mackenzie is somewhere in those canyons," Morrison said, gesturing toward the smoke that still rose from their target location. "She may be the only person who can tell us where Geronimo plans to strike next." It was a rationalization, and every man in the column knew it. Morrison's obsession with Sarah had nothing to do with military intelligence and everything to do with personal humiliation that demanded satisfaction. Martinez studied the dispatch over Morrison's shoulder, noting details that the colonel's rage prevented him from seeing clearly. The message indicated that Geronimo's force had been spotted moving toward the Dragoon Mountains, which put them at least 50 miles from their current location. But Martinez also knew something that didn't appear in any military dispatch. Apache war parties moved in ways that white officers rarely understood, spreading out across vast territories to create the impression of being everywhere at once. 100 warriors could become 20 separate bands, each capable of independent action while maintaining communication through signals that cavalry scouts couldn't interpret. "Colonel," Martinez said carefully, "there's something else you should know about this area." "What?" "It's sacred ground to the Apache. The canyon where that smoke is rising, it's called Spirit Water Canyon. Apache warriors have been coming here for vision quests since before my grandfather was born." Morrison's hand moved to his saber hilt, a gesture that had become automatic whenever he received information that complicated his plans. "What are you telling me, Martinez?" "I'm telling you that if Nalnish has taken the woman to Spirit Water Canyon, he's not just hiding from cavalry, he's claiming spiritual protection for whatever he's doing there." The revelation struck Morrison with unexpected force. He had spent 8 years fighting Apache warriors without ever really understanding the cultural forces that motivated their resistance. To him, they were simply obstacles to be overcome through superior firepower and military discipline. But if Sarah was being held in a place that Apache considered sacred, it meant that her rescue would require more than tactical superiority. It would require violating beliefs that Apache warriors would die to protect. "Then we'll violate their sacred ground and teach them that American authority extends everywhere in this territory," Morrison declared. O'Malley and Martinez exchanged glances that spoke of professional soldiers who recognized when their commanding officer had moved beyond reason into the territory, where personal obsession masqueraded as military duty. In the distance, smoke continued to rise from Spirit Water Canyon, carrying prayers and warnings into the morning sky. The Apache smoke signal mirror in Nalnish's hands caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in controlled flashes that carried meaning across miles of mountain terrain. The polished metal surface had been crafted by his grandfather from silver, taken in raids against Mexican settlements, beaten thin and polished to perfection for the ancient art of long-distance communication. 3 short flashes, followed by 2 long ones, then a pause before the pattern repeated. The message was simple but urgent. "White soldiers approach. Send help." From his position on the canyon rim, Nalnish could see answering flashes from hidden Apache positions throughout the surrounding mountains. His people had been watching the cavalry's approach for hours, using signal mirrors and smoke to coordinate a response that would teach Morrison the difference between hunting individual Apache and facing organized resistance. "How many will come?" Sarah asked, standing beside him as he worked the mirror with practiced precision. "Enough," Nalnish replied, adding a new sequence to his message. "Woman with Apache blood seeks protection. Honor the old way." The addition of that phrase changed everything about the military situation developing around them. Apache law required that tribal members protect their own regardless of personal cost, and Sarah's mixed heritage gave her a claim on Apache loyalty that transcended political consideration. Below them in the canyon, Chato and the other warriors prepared defensive positions with the calm efficiency of men who had spent their lives fighting superior numbers. They moved rocks to create firing positions, cleared fields of observation, and checked weapons with the methodical attention that meant the difference between victory and death. Sarah watched these preparations with growing understanding of what her choice to stay with Nalnish would cost in blood. These men were risking their lives not for abstract principles, but for their leader's decision to protect a woman who carried Apache ancestry in her veins. "They're doing this for me," she said quietly. "They're doing this because it's right." Apache people don't abandon their own, no matter how complicated the circumstance. Another series of flashes answered from the eastern peaks, and Nolish's expression brightened as he interpreted the message. "My grandmother comes," he said with satisfaction, "with 20 warriors from our winter camp." "Your grandmother is a warrior?" "My grandmother is the band's medicine woman, and the mother of 3 war chiefs. When she speaks, even the youngest warriors listen." The idea of an Apache grandmother leading armed men into battle struck Sarah as impossible until she remembered her own great-grandmother's stories about frontier women who fought beside their men when survival demanded it. The West had always required different kinds of courage from its women. "Will she accept me?" Nalnish paused in his signaling to study Sarah's face with the serious attention he reserved for important questions. "She'll test you. Apache ways require that anyone claiming tribal protection prove their worthiness through action rather than words." "What kind of test?" "I don't know. My grandmother sees things that others miss, understands connections that aren't obvious to younger people. She'll know what you need to prove and how you need to prove it." More flashes answered from the southern approach, indicating that Apache reinforcements were moving to cut off Morrison's retreat routes. What had begun as a simple pursuit was rapidly becoming a tactical nightmare for the cavalry column. "Nalnish," Sarah said, touching his arm to get his full attention. "If this goes wrong, if people die because of me, I'll never forgive myself. People have been dying in this conflict since before you were born. Today's battle isn't about you personally. It's about whether Apache people can still protect what they consider sacred." He folded the signal mirror and secured it in his medicine bundle, then turned to face Sarah with an expression that carried the weight of decisions that would echo through both their lives. "But I want you to understand something clearly. If my grandmother accepts you as Apache, there's no going back to the white world. You'll be Apache for the rest of your life, with all the dangers and responsibilities that choice carries." Sarah looked down at the Apache courtship necklace around her throat, feeling its weight as both ornament and obligation. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of horses moving through rocky terrain as Morrison's cavalry closed the final distance to Spirit Water Canyon. "And if she doesn't accept me, then you'll have to choose between going back to Morrison or dying here with people who tried to help you." The harsh reality of frontier justice struck Sarah with unexpected clarity. There would be no negotiated settlements, no comfortable compromises that satisfied everyone involved. Only stark choices that demanded absolute commitment to whatever path she selected. "Then I'd better be worthy of acceptance," she said, meaning every word. Nalish smiled, and for the first time since the pursuit began, Sarah saw hope in his dark eyes. The sacred war paint ingredients spread across the flat stone looked like earth itself, offering its power to those brave enough to claim it. Red ochre from the sacred cliffs, white clay from the hidden springs, yellow from the desert flowers that bloomed after rain, and black charcoal from lightning-struck trees. Each pigment carried spiritual significance that transformed warriors from mere men into vessels for ancestral power. Nerlish's grandmother, Maria Yazi, 78, knelt beside the stone with the careful reverence of someone who had painted warriors for battle since before Sarah was born. Her weathered hands moved with practiced precision as she mixed the pigments with water blessed by Apache medicine men, creating designs that would mark Sarah's transformation from white woman to Apache warrior. "You understand what this means?" Maria asked, in accented English, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. "I understand that there's no going back after this. More than that, these paints carry the spirits of Apache warriors who died fighting for their people. When you wear them, their courage becomes your courage, their strength becomes your strength." Sarah knelt before the old woman, feeling the weight of ceremony that connected her to generations of Apache resistance. Around them, 20 Apache warriors prepared for battle with the quiet efficiency of men who had perfected the art of war through necessity and survival. Maria dipped her finger in red ochre and began painting a line across Sarah's forehead, speaking in Apache as she worked. The paint felt cool against Sarah's skin, but underneath the physical sensation was something deeper, a sense of connection to forces that had nothing to do with white civilization's understanding of reality. "She says you carry the spirit of bright water, woman," Nalnish translated from his position nearby. "Your grandmother's power flows in your blood, waiting to be awakened." The old woman continued painting, adding white lightning bolts down Sarah's cheeks and yellow circles around her eyes. Each symbol carried specific meaning in Apache warrior tradition, marking her as someone under spiritual protection while acknowledging her mixed heritage. "The black," Maria said in English, holding up the charcoal pigment. "This marks those who have faced death and chosen to fight rather than surrender. You ready for this choice?" Sarah looked around the canyon where Apache warriors checked their weapons and took positions among the rocks. These men were risking their lives because their leader had chosen to protect her, and now she was being offered the chance to fight beside them rather than hide behind their courage. "I'm ready." Maria painted 2 black stripes across Sarah's chin, then sat back to study her work with the critical eye of an artist evaluating her creation. "Now you look like an Apache warrior, but paint is easy part. Fighting is when we learn who you really are." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, growing louder as Morrison's cavalry closed the final distance to Spirit Water Canyon. Sarah could hear the jingle of equipment and the careful way horses picked their footing on rocky ground. "How many?" she asked. 20 cavalry, maybe 25, replied Chato from his position near the canyon mouth. "They come fast, but not careful. White soldiers think Apache warriors are cowards who run from fair fight." Maria laughed, a sound like wind through dry grass. Morrison about to learn difference between hunting scattered bands and fighting prepared warriors. She handed Sarah a Winchester rifle, taken from a previous cavalry patrol, along with a bandolier of ammunition that had once belonged to soldiers who underestimated Apache determination. "You know how to use this? My father taught me to hunt when I was 12. He said proper ladies should understand how to provide for themselves if necessary." "Good. Today you hunt different kind of animal." The old woman's eyes held no mercy for the men approaching their sanctuary. She had buried too many grandchildren killed by cavalry raids to feel sympathy for soldiers who chose to make war on Apache families. "Sarah," Naldish said, moving close enough to speak privately, "stay near my grandmother during the fighting. She survived 40 years of battles by knowing when to fight and when to take cover." "What about you?" "I'll be where Apache leaders belong during battle, in front of my warriors, making sure Morrison understands the cost of hunting Apache people." The war paint on Sarah's face felt like a mask that revealed her true nature rather than concealing it. For the first time in her life, she was preparing to fight for something she believed in, rather than accepting whatever fate others decided was appropriate for her. In the distance, she could hear Morrison's voice calling orders to his men as they prepared for what they believed would be a simple rescue operation. They had no idea they were riding into a trap set by warriors who had spent their entire lives learning how to make white soldiers regret their assumptions about Apache courage. The traditional Apache wedding ceremony items lay arranged on a blanket woven by Maria's mother half a century ago, each object carrying sacred significance that bound souls across the divides of culture, blood, and time. Eagle feathers blessed by medicine men, sweet grass that carried prayers to the spirit world, turquoise stones that represented eternal love, and a wedding basket decorated with patterns that told the story of Apache creation myth. "We do this now," Maria said urgently, her weathered hands arranging the ceremonial objects with practiced efficiency. "Before the fighting starts, before the world tries to separate what the spirits have chosen to join." Sarah knelt beside Narnish on the sacred blanket, acutely aware that rifle fire might interrupt their vows at any moment. Morrison's cavalry was less than a mile away, close enough that they could hear individual voices calling orders and the metallic sound of weapons being checked and loaded. "Is this legal?" Sarah asked, then immediately felt foolish for applying white man's concepts to Apache spiritual practices. "Legal by whose law?" Maria replied with a slight smile. Apache law says two people who choose each other before the spirits need no permission from white men's government. The old woman began the ceremony by sprinkling sweet grass on the small fire that burned in a circle of stones. Smoke rose with the distinctive scent that Apache people had associated with sacred occasions for countless generations. Nalnish, son of Standing Bear, grandson of Mountain Wolf, do you take this woman as your wife according to the old ways? I do, Nalnish replied in Apache, his voice carrying across the canyon with the gravity of an oath that would bind him for life. Sarah Mackenzie, granddaughter of Brightwater Woman, child of two worlds, do you take this man as your husband, according to Apache law? Sarah looked into Nalnish's eyes, seeing there the reflection of everything she had been searching for without knowing it. Courage without cruelty, strength without domination, love that demanded growth rather than submission. I do, she said in English, then repeated the words in the Apache phrases Maria had taught her during their hurried preparation. Maria lifted the wedding basket, its intricate patterns catching the morning light as she turned it in her hands. The basket had been used in her own wedding ceremony 55 years earlier, and in the ceremonies of her daughters and granddaughters, before Apache customs began giving way to reservation life. This basket holds the food that will sustain your marriage, Maria said, offering cornmeal that had been blessed with prayers for fertility and abundance. Share it equally, and you will never know hunger. Share it with generous hearts, and your love will feed not just yourselves but your children and your children's children. They ate the cornmeal together, its simple taste carrying the weight of promises that would echo through whatever time they were granted. Sarah felt the grains dissolve on her tongue and understood that she was consuming more than food. She was taking Apache tradition into her body, making it part of her flesh and blood. Now the turquoise, Maria said, offering two stones that had been polished smooth by generations of Apache hands. These came from the sacred mines where our people have gathered stones since the beginning of time. They will remind you that true love endures like stone, even when everything else changes. Nalnish placed one turquoise stone in Sarah's palm, then closed her fingers around it with infinite gentleness. The stone felt warm, as if it had absorbed heat from all the hands that had held it before hers. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment and Morrison's voice calling final orders to his men. The wedding ceremony was being conducted in the shadow of approaching violence, but somehow that made the vows more rather than less meaningful. Eagle feathers, Maria said, offering the sacred plumes that marked this as a warrior's wedding. These carry the prayers of your ancestors and the blessings of the spirits who watch over Apache people. She placed one feather in Sarah's hair and another in Nalnish's war bonnet, marking them both as people under spiritual protection. By the power of earth and sky, by the blessing of the four directions, by the wisdom of those who came before and the hope of those who will come after, I declare you husband and wife according to Apache law. Thunder rumbled overhead, but it wasn't the storm returning. It was the sound of cavalry horses at full gallop, charging toward the canyon entrance with the confidence of men who believed superior firepower guaranteed victory. This is Sarah Nalnish, Maria said with satisfaction, using the English title that would mark Sarah's new identity. Time to show your husband what kind of warrior he married. Sarah stood with the wedding turquoise still warm in her palm, feeling the weight of the eagle feather in her hair and the war paint on her face. She was no longer the woman who had fled Fort McDowell in terror and confusion. She was Apache now, bound by marriage to a man worth fighting for, and protected by spiritual forces that cavalry sabers could not cut. Morrison's wanted poster crackled in the wind as he unfolded it for his men to see. The official government document marking Sarah Mackenzie as a traitor to her own race and a criminal deserving of federal justice. The poster bore her likeness sketched by a Fort McDowell artist, along with charges that would ensure her hanging if she were captured alive. Treason, consorting with hostile Indians, theft of government property and aiding enemy combatants, Morrison read aloud to his assembled cavalry. The federal government has authorized any means necessary to apprehend this woman and bring her to justice. Sergeant O'Malley studied the poster with the grim expression of a professional soldier who recognized political maneuvering disguised as military necessity. The charges were serious enough to justify whatever violence might be required to capture Sarah, but they also marked her as someone who could never return to white civilization, even if she wanted to. Colonel, O'Malley said carefully, "These charges, they're capital offense. If we take her alive, she'll hang. That's a decision for military tribunals to make, Sergeant. Our job is to retrieve an American citizen from Apache captivity and restore order to this territory." Morrison's rationalization fooled no one, but it provided legal cover for whatever atrocities might be necessary to satisfy his obsession with reclaiming the woman who had dared to reject his authority. Martinez studied the canyon ahead through field glasses, noting defensive positions that spoke of experienced warriors who understood how to use terrain to their advantage. The Apache had chosen their ground well, forcing the cavalry to attack uphill against prepared positions while exposing themselves to crossfire from multiple directions. "Colonel, this isn't going to be easy. They've got the high ground and plenty of cover. We'll take heavy casualties trying to dig them out. Then we'll take casualties. That's what soldiers do." The casual dismissal of his men's lives sent a ripple of unease through the cavalry ranks. These were veteran Indian fighters who had survived because they understood the difference between necessary risks and pointless sacrifice. "Sir," called Corporal Jenkins from his position with the advance guard, "there's something you should see." Morrison rode forward to where Jenkins pointed toward the canyon rim. Through his field glasses, he could see figures moving among the rocks, but what caught his attention was the unmistakable sight of a woman wearing Apache war paint and carrying a rifle. "That's her," Morrison whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of rage and disbelief. "That's Sarah Mackenzie, dressed like a savage and armed like a warrior." The transformation was so complete that for a moment Morrison questioned whether his eyes were deceiving him. The refined Eastern lady he had courted at Fort McDowell had been replaced by someone who moved with the fluid confidence of an Apache fighter. "Sir," O'Malley said quietly, "maybe she's there by choice. Maybe she doesn't want to be rescued." Morrison's hand moved to his saber hilt, with the automatic gesture that had become his response to any suggestion that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the situation. "No white woman chooses to live like an animal among savages. Sarge, she's obviously been brutalized into submission and needs to be reminded of her proper place in civilized society." The wanted poster fluttered in Morrison's hand as wind swept down from the mountain peaks, carrying the scent of pine and sage that marked this as country where white authority had never been fully established. Federal warrants might carry legal weight in Washington, but they meant nothing to Apache warriors who recognized no government except their own tribal councils. "Form a skirmish line," Morrison commanded. "We'll advance in 3 columns and converge on their position from multiple directions. Once we have them pinned down, we can negotiate for Miss Mackenzie's release." Martinez exchanged glances with O'Malley, both men recognizing the tactical impossibility of what Morrison was ordering. Apache warriors didn't pin down easily, and they certainly didn't negotiate when their sacred ground was being violated by cavalry forces. "Colonel," Martinez said carefully, "Apache don't usually negotiate when they're defending their own people, and if they've accepted the woman as one of their own, she's not one of their own," Morrison snapped. "She's an American citizen who has been kidnapped and brainwashed by hostile Indians. When we restore her to proper custody, she'll remember who she really is." The wanted poster bore an official seal that represented the full authority of the United States government. But as Morrison studied the canyon where Apache warriors waited in prepared positions, he realized that federal authority meant nothing to people who had been fighting for their survival against impossible odds for 30 years. In the distance he could hear the faint sound of Apache voices calling to each other in their native language, coordinating defenses that would turn his rescue mission into a battle for survival that few of his men would be likely to survive. The ancient Apache war shield bore the scars of a dozen battles, its rawhide surface marked by bullet holes and knife cuts that told the story of its previous owner's courage in defending his people against overwhelming odds. Nalnish had inherited the shield from his father, who had carried it during the Apache wars of the 1870s, and now he raised it against Morrison's charging cavalry with the same determination that had sustained Apache resistance for generations. The shield's painted symbols depicted a mountain lion stalking through lightning, representing the Apache warrior's ability to strike without warning and vanish before enemies could respond. Red and black pigments had faded with age, but the spiritual power they contained remained as strong as the day medicine men had blessed them with prayers for protection and victory. Morrison's cavalry charged up the canyon in 3 columns, their blue uniforms bright against the red sandstone walls as they rode toward what they believed would be an easy victory over scattered Apache warriors. The colonel led the center column personally, his saber drawn and his face twisted with the rage that had driven him beyond the boundaries of military sense. Sarah crouched behind a boulder 50 yards from Nalnish's position, her Winchester rifle steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The war paint on her face felt like armor that protected not just her skin but her spirit, connecting her to generations of Apache women who had fought to defend their families and their way of life. The first rifle shots cracked across the canyon as Apache warriors opened fire from concealed positions among the rocks. Cavalry horses screamed and reared as bullets found their marks, sending riders tumbling to the rocky ground where they became easy targets for follow-up shots. Morrison's charge faltered as his men realized they were riding into a carefully prepared ambush rather than routing frightened Indians. The canyon walls that had seemed to provide cover for their approach now became death traps that channeled them into killing zones where Apache marksmen could fire at will. "Take cover," Sergeant O'Malley shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos of gunfire and dying horses. Nalnish moved through the battle with the fluid grace of a predator, using his shield to deflect bullets while returning fire with deadly accuracy. Each shot was carefully aimed, conserving ammunition while maximizing damage to an enemy force that had foolishly exposed itself to superior tactics. Sarah fired at a cavalryman who was trying to flank Nalnish's position, her bullet taking the man from his saddle with the clean precision her father had taught her during hunting trips in Massachusetts forests. The knowledge that she had just killed a human being should have horrified her, but instead she felt only grim satisfaction that she was protecting the man she loved. Morrison fought his way through the chaos toward the position where he had seen Sarah, his obsession with reclaiming her driving him forward, despite the tactical disaster unfolding around him. His saber caught the morning light as he cut down an Apache warrior who tried to block his path, the blade drawing blood that splattered across the ancient shield symbols. "Sarah!" Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Enough of this madness. Come with me now and I'll see that you receive medical treatment instead of a hangman's noose." Sarah rose from her cover to face the man who had driven her into the wilderness, her rifle trained on his chest, with steady hands that showed no trace of the trembling woman who had fled Fort McDowell. "My name is Sarah Nalnish," she called back, using the Apache name that marked her transformation from white woman to tribal member, "and I'm exactly where I choose to be." Morrison's face contorted with rage that went beyond military failure to something deeper and more personal. The woman he had claimed as his rightful property had not only rejected his authority, but had embraced the very people he considered beneath human consideration. "You're not Apache," he screamed, spurring his horse toward her position. "You're a white woman who belongs with white people." The ancient war shield deflected Morrison's desperate saber thrust as Nalnish intercepted the colonel's charge, the two men meeting in personal combat that symbolized the larger conflict between Apache independence and white domination. Around them, the battle continued with the desperate intensity of men fighting for their lives against impossible odds. Apache warriors used their knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect, while surviving cavalrymen learned too late that they had underestimated both the tactical skill and the fierce determination of their enemies. The shield that had protected Apache warriors for generations now stood between Sarah and the man who refused to accept her choice, its painted symbols bearing witness to another chapter. In the long struggle between two worlds that could not coexist peacefully, the newborn's Apache cradle board rested against the cabin wall like a promise of continuity, its intricate beadwork catching the afternoon light that filtered through pine branches outside the hidden canyon sanctuary. Sarah had spent 3 months crafting the traditional carrier, learning from Maria's patient instruction how to weave protective symbols into patterns that would guard her child's spirit during its vulnerable early years. 5 years had passed since the battle at Spirit Water Canyon, 5 years that had transformed two fugitives into respected members of an Apache band that had found ways to survive in the mountains without submitting to reservation life. The cradle board represented everything they had built together: love that transcended cultural boundaries, hope that grew stronger despite external pressures, and the living proof that harmony between different worlds was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Sarah looked up from nursing her 6-month-old son, David Nalnish, as her husband entered the cabin carrying fresh venison from his morning hunt. At 37, Nalnish moved with the same fluid grace that had first captured her attention, but now there was a contentment in his bearing that spoke of a man who had found his proper place in the world. "He grows strong," Nalnish observed, settling beside his wife and son with the quiet satisfaction of a father watching his child thrive. "He has his father's eyes and his great-grandmother's stubborn spirit," Sarah replied, shifting the baby so Nalnish could see the alert intelligence that marked David as someone who would bridge two worlds just as his parents had done. The child was beautiful in the way that mixed heritage children often were, combining the best features of both ancestries into something entirely new. His skin carried the warm tone that would let him move between Apache and white communities without automatically marking him as belonging to either. And his dark eyes held depth that suggested he would inherit his parents' ability to see beyond surface differences to deeper truth. Outside their cabin, the hidden canyon had become home to 43 Apache people who had chosen independence over reservation security. They lived by hunting, gathering, and small-scale farming that provided enough sustenance without attracting attention from military patrols that still searched for hostile Indians. Maria's voice could be heard from the central cooking area, telling stories to the younger children about Apache heroes who had found ways to preserve their culture despite overwhelming pressure to abandon traditional ways. At 83, she had become the band's keeper of memory, ensuring that essential knowledge would survive even if their physical isolation eventually ended. "Your grandmother wants to know when we'll have the naming ceremony," Nalnish said, running a gentle finger along his son's cheek. "When he's ready to hear his Apache name spoken aloud, names have power, and children need time to grow into the spirits they're meant to carry." Sarah had learned much about Apache's spiritual practices during her years among the mountain people, but she had also contributed her own understanding of child rearing that drew from both white and native traditions. Their son would be raised with the best of both worlds, equipped to navigate whatever future awaited him. The sound of approaching horses drew Nalnish to the window, but his posture remained relaxed as he identified the riders as friends rather than threats. 2 young Apache men rode into the canyon carrying news from the outside world that reached their sanctuary through networks of communication that white authorities never fully understood. "What do they bring?" Sarah asked. "Word from the reservation. The agent there has been asking questions about missing Apache families, promising rewards for information about mountain hideouts." The news wasn't unexpected, but it reminded them that their peaceful existence remained fragile, dependent on continued vigilance and the goodwill of people who could betray them for money or official favor. "Will we have to move again? Perhaps, but not immediately. We've learned to live like water, flowing around obstacles instead of fighting them directly." Sarah adjusted the baby in her arms, feeling the weight of responsibilities that extended beyond her own family to include the entire band that had accepted her as one of their own. Her transformation from Boston society lady to Apache mother had been complete, but it was her son who represented the true bridge between worlds that had seemed irreconcilably divided. "David will never know what it feels like to be torn between two identities," she said with satisfaction. "We'll be whole in ways we never were." Zalnish smiled, reaching for his son with hands that had once carried weapons in anger, but now touched only with love and protection. He'll carry the best of both peoples forward into whatever comes next. The cradle board stood ready to hold their child during the long journeys that lay ahead, its protective symbols gleaming with the hope that love could indeed conquer the boundaries that separated human hearts from recognizing their fundamental unity.